Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Baekdal Plus podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about something essential for all publishers in the future, which is the importance of focusing on evergreen content. So grab yourself a hot cup of chocolate or whatever else you prefer, and let's get started. So, what is evergreen content? Well, let me start by explaining it this way. One of the things I often talk about is the importance of editorial analytics. This is a type of analytics where the focus of your metrics is to specifically help you with your editorial goals and performance. There are many different types of editorial metrics, anything from watch time and read rates that indicate how good you are at transforming your audience into actual readers, to far more advanced metrics where you build up a score using several different indicators. But one of the things that almost all editorial metrics should be based on is how they link to the all-important lifetime value. Usually when we talk about lifetime value, we focus on the audience itself, like what is the lifetime value of your readers, how much revenue are they generating over time, and how much influence this has on whatever outcome we want. But lifetime value isn't just about your audience, it's also about the other elements of your publication. So your journalists have a lifetime value and your content has a lifetime value. And today we're going to talk about the content lifetime value. Measuring this is not as simple as it sounds because there are so many different ways of defining it. You can measure it in terms of revenue, for example, ad revenue, subscription revenue, or affiliate revenue that you then attribute to each article. But how do you get that revenue to begin with? Well, you need people to visit your content, and the more people who see it, the higher the revenue potential. So far, this is all very simple. More people equals more revenue. The problem is that the volume of people who will see your content is very often limited by time. So if your content is only relevant or exposed for one day, there is a limit to how many people you can reach within that time span. So another way to increase your revenue potential is to expand the time that your content is relevant for. If you can make an article relevant for 2 days instead of 1, then you have the potential to reach far more people. And if you can make an article stay relevant for a week, your potential is even higher. If you can make something relevant for several months or even years, we start to see the potential for the long tail where the slow trickle of traffic over time actually starts to make up most of your revenue as a whole. There's also the concept of cost. If you can make content so valuable that it can be used more than once, you wouldn't need to produce as much content to begin with. So instead of publishing 150 articles per day, you could potentially reach the same number of people by posting 2 articles per week. And wouldn't that be amazing? So the lifetime value of your content, or what I call the longevity of your content, is absolutely critical. And the ultimate level of this is when your content turns into what we call evergreen content. Evergreen is a phrase that we have borrowed from nature. It describes those types of plants that have green leaves all year. In other words, they are green forever. For content, it's the same thing. An evergreen article is a story that stays relevant with a high traffic potential forever. So, what are some examples of that? Well, the book industry is often defined by evergreen content. Jules Verne's wonderful book, Around the World in 80 Days from 1873, is as beautiful to read today as it was back then. It's an evergreen book. Did I say read? Of course I mean listen to, because even though technology like audiobooks and smartphones didn't exist in the late 1800s, because the book has remained relevant, audiobook versions are now available and as enjoyable as the printed book was back then. And many other forms of content have the potential to become evergreen as well. Obviously, not all content can stay evergreen forever, but the more you can maximize the longevity of a story, the more ways you can potentially monetize it, and the higher the overall revenue potential is going to be. Now, sadly, one group within the media industry seem to have forgotten all about this, and that is the traditional publishers. The digital natives already figured this one out. When you look at bloggers, many blog articles are written in such a way that they can be read for a long time to come. This is because bloggers know that while they might have an initial boost of traffic within the first few days, the real power of that traffic are those views that come in the following months. So bloggers know that it's absolutely critical to focus on posting something that will stay relevant and interesting over a long period of time, because they would never be able to build up that potential in just the first day. We see exactly the same thing with YouTubers. All the successful YouTubers publish content in a way that is almost the opposite of how traditional publishers publish videos. YouTubers aim for longevity so that their videos keep attracting views for as long as possible. For instance, they make sure that each video is a self-contained unit, meaning that you can watch that one video and you will get the full story. They also make the videos quite long, often 10 to 20 minutes, because they're not focused on just attracting random people. They're focusing on building up an audience. There is also an element of momentum in that they are designing their videos in such a way that when you have watched one video, you have to watch another one. And they often do this in a really smart way. For instance, YouTuber and fitness trainer The Body Coach is currently publishing a series called 28 Days of Sweat. Each video is one full daily fitness session, and as such can be watched separately from all the others. But combined, they create a fitness challenge over 28 days that people can then take part in. Think about the momentum that this creates, but also think about the longevity. A video series like that is something that you can use forever. You can watch it right now or sometime next year. It doesn't matter. The video will stay relevant, and when you watch one video, you are motivated to also watch the other 27 videos. In other words, it's evergreen content. YouTubers know this by heart, and they know how important it is for their success, their audience development, and of course their revenue potential. But what about traditional publishers? Well, traditional publishers are doing the exact opposite, in that the style of reporting that we see often is what we call throwaway news. It's content that only has a lifespan of mere hours, after which it becomes completely irrelevant. It's random and it's unfocused, and it doesn't have any momentum. And sometimes it's even worse than that. Sometimes an article will have negative longevity, meaning that the content has so little value that each article by itself doesn't even give you the news within that initial moment. We see this most clearly in newspapers. In the old days of print, news was written as self-contained stories. So if something important happened, the journalists knew that they had to uncover the full story before the deadline, because publishing an unfinished story was unacceptable. But look at it today. Today, most newspapers break up their stories into incomplete units, and instead of writing one good article that tells people what is going on, they write 10 articles that each tell you nothing. So the first article will say something like, "There's been an explosion and the fire department is on their way." And as a reader, you look at this and you say, okay, but what has actually happened? Then the next article comes out a short time later, which tells us that they're putting out the fire and the police have blocked off the street. And again, the audience is saying, well, duh, obviously they're doing that. Stop wasting our time and tell us what is really going on. But the newspapers keep doing this, and even after it's all over, the 10th article is just as bad as the first one. At no point were you actually provided with an article that gives you the full picture. Just stop and think about that for a moment. It's crap. Can you imagine picking up something in the morning newspaper and every single article was just incomplete moments of reporting that didn't really tell you anything? How many people would subscribe to a newspaper like that? Well, the answer is obvious. None. Nobody would do that. It has zero value, but this is often the reality with how news is covered today. But think about this in terms of digital as well. Imagine if a YouTuber tried to do this. Imagine if instead of publishing one really good 10-minute video, they posted 10 incomplete ones with no real substance or information. What do you think would happen to a YouTuber channel like that? Would that work? Would they get a strong and loyal audience? Would they be able to convert what they do into real revenue potential? No, of course not. If they did this, they would fail. But this is what we do in traditional media. We also see this problem with how traditional publishers talk about social media compared to how digital natives talk about it. For instance, over the past several years, we have seen publishers talk about how they are now creating content for Snapchat, which is a channel with zero longevity and evergreen focus. But what are the digital natives doing? Well, they don't really care about Snapchat because they don't see the potential. It's too shallow and too short to be able to build up any form of real revenue potential. It's the same with Facebook and Instagram TV and all of these other channels. The way traditional publishers talk about them and the way YouTubers talk about them are completely different. YouTubers don't see the potential with those channels mostly because they offer no form of longevity. And without it, the initial burst of traffic that you might get is too shallow and too short for it to be useful. This is the problem with the traditional media world today. We have lost the concept of value in exchange for quick snacks, and the worst thing about it is that we all know it. What I mean is that traditional publishers are making up excuses and they lie to themselves as a way to cover up that they know something isn't working. For instance, they say that young people don't care about anything, so that's why they can't create deep, focused journalism. But this is not true. Young people care far more than old people. We say that young people don't have any attention span, so that's why publishers have to focus on Facebook and Snapchat, make listicles and other crap like that. But again, this is not true. The real trend right now is that young people are leaving Facebook, and they are increasingly turning down Facebook because they just don't see the value of it, while YouTube, Twitch, and other high-focus channels are growing. And the reason young people use channels such as Snapchat or Instagram stories, which are arguably very short in their form, has nothing to do with the format, but has everything to do with the privacy. When you post an Instagram story, it goes away after 24 hours, and that means you don't have to worry about all those problems with your image or publishing or having stalkers spend all their time looking over all your photos for all eternity. So the reason young people choose Instagram stories over an Instagram post has nothing to do with attention span. In fact, what is happening is that young people trade off the longevity of their post in exchange for privacy, because that's more important to them. But as publishers, we are not posting news for the sake of privacy. We are posting for the sake of informing people about important things around us, for the sake of remembering it. You see the problem here? As publishers, we have chosen the completely wrong channel for the purpose of what we do. We want things to be public and memorable, so why do we spend all our time posting our news on a channel that is optimized to be private and non-memorable? Why would this work? Sure, some publishers will tell you that their latest video got 1 million views, but that is also a lie. Those weren't views, those were glimpses. And if you ask all those millions of people if they remember it today, none of them can even remember that it was there, let alone what it was about. So again, in the media world, we have destroyed our longevity on a lie that we tell ourselves. Now, don't get me wrong. I do understand why this is happening. It is not easy to be a traditional publisher in today's world, and for many, the shiny effect of Facebook and all those other social channels caused a tremendous shift in how people discovered content. But that era is over. Social media has grown old, and it shows. When Facebook launched Facebook Watch, the collective response from the public was to not really care that much about it. And when Instagram launched IGTV, most people just said, meh. But most of all, people have realized that social media isn't a platform for all media. Instead, it's a very narrow form of interaction that only really works for a very specific type of moment. For one thing, it's not a news channel. Even though you might accidentally come across a news article, but which you really didn't want to see in the first place. So we have to stop telling ourselves these lies. I could go on and on about this, but let's change the focus from talking about all the problems of the past and instead focus on what we need to do in the future. The key to the future is to bring back the concept of evergreen content and once again make that an essential part of your editorial strategy. So how do we do that? Well, let's start out simple. The three most important elements to focus on are creating content that will stay relevant over time, can be used more than once, and can help you move to the next step. So the next time you write an article, ask yourself if this article would still be usable a month from now. This seems like such a simple thing to say, but it actually requires a massive shift in the editorial and journalistic mindset. Let me give you one example. One of my absolute pet peeves is when journalists cover stories about renewable energy because they're so focused on what is happening right now that they completely forget where we are going. So, from a trend perspective, Earth currently has a big problem called global warming, which is caused by a lot of things, but mainly how we are dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. To fix this, we need to change the way we produce and use electricity. And to do this, we need to change a lot of things. We need to change our cars from being run by diesel or petrol to be powered by electricity or hydrogen, because burning fuel and dumping those fumes out of our exhaust pipe is a really bad idea. Of course, we can't just change the cars, because that would just mean that the coal-powered electric plants would pollute even more. So we also have to change the way we produce the electricity and shift that to things like solar, wind, or hydro plants. Of course, when we do that, we end up with other problems. For instance, how our electric grid is primarily designed for old-style electricity and doesn't cope very well with the fluctuations of renewable energy. So to fix that, we need to rethink the grid and incorporate batteries and battery management into that mix. The problem is that we can't do all of these things at the same rate, so the future of electric cars will probably arrive before we have really fixed the problem with the electric grid. And the problem with batteries will probably only be fixed after that. And this means that during this transition, things are not going to be perfect. And it might actually look like some things are getting worse in the short run before we can catch up with the other things that also needs to change. So what does that have to do with journalism and evergreen focus? Well, today we see a lot of articles in newspapers talking about the problems with renewable energy. For instance, about a month ago I came across an article where one of the big Australian newspapers wrote that people who are installing solar panels in their homes are causing disruptions in the electric grid. And if it continues, it might lead to blackouts and blown transformers in the future. The journalist didn't say it directly, but most of the article put the blame for this on people installing solar panels instead of on the existing energy companies who are unwilling to upgrade the grid to work with that type of power. Just think about that for a moment. As a newspaper, they were basically arguing that people shouldn't buy solar panels, but if they do that, we wouldn't solve anything. We just keep having the same problems with global warming. We often see the same with electric cars. Newspapers have posted so many articles about how electric cars are actually causing more overall pollution than diesel cars due to the fact that the vast amount of electricity a car needs is coming from highly polluting power plants. Now, first of all, this is not actually true, but again, that's a very weird kind of journalism. Because what is your solution to this? To tell people to stop buying electric cars and just go back to driving around in diesel cars? That's not going to solve anything. That just keeps things as bad as they are now. The solution instead would have been to refocus the article on the problem with the electric grid and in that way get them to move up the timetable for producing more renewable energy for the electric cars to use. In other words, because newspapers are so focused on the things that are happening right now, we often forget to focus on where we are going. It's another problem with lack of longevity in the editorial focus, and it creates a style of reporting which has almost zero value. So, the way to make an article usable for more than just a moment is to ask yourself, how will people think about this in the future? If you are a journalist writing about electric cars and how much they pollute today, ask yourself if this will still be relevant in a year from now. Will this still be true then? This is the mindset that needs to change at every level of a newspaper, because our lack of focus on evergreen content makes us sound like, well, old geezers. And this is just one example, but it applies to almost every topic. Think about something like fact-checking. When we fact-check a story, it's not just about whether something is true right now. It's more so about whether it's going to be true or usable for people to read tomorrow, and the morning after that, and then next week, or month, or year. But this is not just about looking ahead and trying to identify the trends of what we cover. It's also about whether a story still makes sense in the future. For most stories in the press, this is often not the case. Partly because of how we break up the stories into snacks, which makes them impossible to read later on, and partly because of editorial focus that looks so much at the present that we lose the perspective. This is also true when people are looking for something specific. For instance, if something happens and people want to know what that was about, this method of turning news into a live streaming event doesn't really help people the next day in any way. I come across this all the time. When I'm busy writing, I often tune out the world around me in order to focus, which means that I will go back to the newspaper the next day to read about something I've heard about. But already the next day, it's almost impossible to get any idea about what happened, because the news has already moved on and all the articles are just bits and pieces of the story. This is a big part of why we have so much trouble turning news into something of value. We have to get away from this culture of throwaway news where things become impossible to read in a useful way after just 24 hours. So think about the relevancy of your content over time. The second element is the importance of getting the same content used more than once. This is not just important in terms of creating something of value, but as I said earlier, it also has a massive impact on reducing costs. If you can get people to use your content more than once, you don't need to publish so much content to begin with. It's all about making the content usable. Now, making content usable can mean many things, but the elements that you usually add is data, referencing, or learning. Let me give you a simple example. We just talked about electric cars, and last year The Guardian published an article about how much electric cars pollute. The article has all the flaws I just mentioned, but it does actually contain a lot of useful data points. The problem is that this data is published as dead data. What is dead data, you ask? Well, it's data that never updates because it's not linked to a data source. This means that all the data in that article are probably out of date because the data has changed, and this is a problem we see a lot with publishers today. Another example is an article from a Danish newspaper. They created a wonderful visualization of consumer spending in Denmark, and it was a really brilliant article that I've used many times. But the problem was that it was published in 2015 using data from 2012, which was again published as dead data. This means that today, that article is more than 5 years out of date, even though it uses data that is updated each year by the National Bureau of Statistics. They made this brilliant article where they took this continually updated data and then they killed it. Think about the missed opportunity here. This is a print mindset to publishing. Compare that to how tech companies report information. For instance, if you go to Google and you look up what is the world population, the number that you are told is the latest number that Google has. In other words, it's live data, or as close to live as possible. So publishers really need to start thinking about how they can create articles that don't die the moment they are published. The other aspect is the learning element. The example I always use is that of fitness publishing. And the question I ask editors is, why are you still publishing random articles when you can offer people real training? Look at what every fitness YouTuber is doing. They're not just publishing random content, they're helping you train, like the body coach and his 28 days of sweat that I mentioned earlier. But this is about much more than just fitness. If you have a food magazine, the recipes are something that people can use more than once. So it's really important that you present and design them in such a way that they can be used as such, instead of just publishing them as regular articles. A good example of this, of course, is New York Times Cooking, who have transformed the way that they are publishing recipes from being just a random article in a print magazine to an actual useful site that people can subscribe to and use. Also think about it in terms of something like a business magazine. The purpose of a business magazine is essentially to provide your readers with a form of business intelligence centered around your journalism. But think about what that really is. In a business magazine, you are teaching companies about their competitors, their market operations, and focus. So why not change your focus to be more like a reference than just publishing random articles? Ask yourself, what would you need to change to get people to use this content more than once? Well, it needs to be more than just about the moment of news. Instead, it needs to be something that people can use in their jobs. I'm reminded here of VGSN, a very successful publisher focusing on trend forecasting, mostly for the fashion industry. What they do is to center their publishing on content that people can turn back to over and over again, like trend forecasts that people can reference every time they start a new project, or color forecasts and news that again can be used for every project or for your future planning, or inspiration decks and merchandising revenue data that you can use to plan your product portfolio and a lot of other things like that. Unlike almost every other publisher, they have centered their entire business around creating what is essentially evergreen content. Their model is to create content that you can use for longer than just the moment when it was published. And it's such a brilliant business model. This then brings us to the last element, which is how you can define evergreen content around getting people to the next step. One of the key problems with many larger traditional publishers is that your journalists often don't have a good sense of what all the other journalists wrote. In fact, even for a single journalist, because they are often focusing on so many different topics every week, there's very little continuity between stories. What this means is that traditional publishers are exceptionally bad at resurfacing old content. Again, you can compare this to channels such as YouTube, where every YouTuber uses both the YouTube card system and the end screens to specifically direct people to other videos. They do this not just to get more views, but also to build up momentum. And this is an incredibly important element of turning existing content into evergreen content. In fact, notice how every YouTuber ends their videos. They are always trying to direct you to another video. The problem with traditional publishers is that they mostly do this with a print mindset. What I mean is that when you read a print magazine, you sit down, open the magazine, and then you start to flip the pages. And as you come across an article, you might stop to read it, and then you flip to another page where there's another article. When you do this, you create a lot of views, but you don't necessarily build up any momentum on an article basis. It's the same thing that we see online. Many traditional publishers have been optimizing their views by adding recommended links into their pages, but we're doing it in the wrong way. One example, I recently read an article about Brexit in one of the newspapers in my country, and in the middle of this article was a box with a link to another article that they wanted me to click on. First problem, the box was added to a completely random part of the article, so it had no relation to the text I was currently reading. Think about how insane that is. A YouTuber would never do that. When they tell you about another video that you should watch, they do it in a way that flows naturally from what they are talking about. For instance, a photographer on YouTube might talk about how to make amazing B-roll footage and then mention something about adding music, saying, "I made another video about just that." When they do that, the recommendation builds up value at the exact moment when it makes the most sense. But traditional publishers just add links at random, which does nothing. Secondly, because newspapers are so bad at producing evergreen content, the articles they recommend are often old articles that are out of date, meaning that people don't actually learn anything, and it's basically just a waste of time. Again, YouTubers would never do this. When they recommend a video, it's to add value on top of what you're already seeing, so they only recommend evergreen videos that help build up this momentum. Again, YouTubers would never do this. When they recommend a video, it's to add value on top of what you're already seeing, so they only recommend evergreen videos that help build up this momentum. There's such a big difference between these things. As a publisher, you need to change the way you think about recommended links. First of all, you need to focus on producing evergreen content so that you actually have something valuable and relevant to link to. Then, as journalists, when you write a story, you have to be far more mindful about how that article fits into all the things you already published. It needs to expand the scope of what people are currently reading. This way, every link not only creates more views, it also builds up momentum and adds to the value of how your readers perceive you, which is then what drives subscriptions. And then on top of all this, you get this evergreen effect, which will help you to massively reduce the cost because of how much more your content can be used. The effect of this is amazing. So when you combine all these things I've now talked about, you realize just how incredibly important evergreen content really is, but also how far behind traditional publishers are because of how they have focused on optimizing for the wrong things over the past decade. The real obstacle now is how to change this. As a publisher, you can't just say that you're going to do these things, because the real problem is with many aspects of how traditional companies operate. You really need to dig into this and start to conceptualize how this would work for you. Then you need to redefine your editorial strategy and your editorial metrics. And then comes the really hard part about changing the internal culture, mindset to get everyone to think about this before they start working on the next article, instead of just it being an afterthought. None of this is easy, but it's critical for all publishers today. And as I pointed out several times, the digital natives are already doing this by default. They don't have any of these problems, and they already understand how important it is, the revenue potential that it creates, and how to incorporate it into their workflows. To a digital native, this is not an extra thing they need to do. This is a key element of their core workflow, and as such, is something that they think about at every level of what they do. They think about it when they plan their content, when they record the videos or write articles, when they edit, and afterwards when they promote it. So take the time to think this through and change this culture. And with this, we come to the end of this podcast. I hope it was useful to you, and remember to tell your friends about it, and if you have any questions or comments, just send me an email or reach out to me on Twitter. And as always, thank you for listening.
Hey, I don't get what this is about. You got my head spinning on my shoulders. I feel a burn inside of my chest. See the lines as they blur out. I can feel it knocking me out. You're bringing me higher and higher in every way. And all of my doubts, I can feel them, they're fading away. Oh, you're like a fantasy. I know this can't be real. I'm falling way down, all delusional. I got me feeling like I'm lucid dreaming. Got me flying high. 'Cause I can't believe that I get to have you close. On an endless road, I'm levitating now. In one of those lucid dreams. In one of those lucid dreams. Oh yeah. Wait, you gotta tell me what you did. I saw the world turning in my mind. Oh, yesterday you pulled the rug under my feet. Still I'm trying to wake me up. What if I'm making it all up? You're bringing me higher and higher in every way. And all of my doubts, I can feel them, they're fading away. Oh, you're like a fantasy. I know this can't be real. I'm falling way down, all delusional. 'Cause you got me feeling like I'm lucid dreaming. Got me flying high. 'Cause I can't believe that I get to have you close. On an endless road, I'm levitating now. In one of those lucid dreams. In one of those lucid dreams. I walk within your maze. My head is dizzy like the purple haze. I don't know where we're going, but the clues that you are throwing are leading me back home to you. 'Cause you got